As we were discussing earlier in the program with Congressman Mike Johnson, who chaired today's subcommittee, it's really like we live in two different worlds when you talk about the Democrats and Republicans. I want to play a clip from one of the Democratic members of the committee today, where you had these individuals who had experienced this transgender push, and some of them detransitioned, some of them being forced to shower and undress in front of biological males. So this is Congresswoman Mary Scanlon of Pennsylvania, clip two.
It's a cynical and frankly dangerous political attack on transgender children and their families, driven not by science or facts, but by polling and political strategists determined to mobilize conservative voters through fear. So let's start by setting the record straight. Gender-affirming care is safe and effective.
She's the ranking member on the subcommittee. Now I want to go to Congresswoman Harriet Hageman, who was actually on the program yesterday. She's a member of the Judiciary Committee. Here is what she had to say, clip three.
There are only two sexes, boys are girls, or boys are boys, yet girls are girls, and one cannot become the other. In fact, and especially when it comes to children, it seems to me that gender-affirming care is better described as sexual lobotomy.
Increasingly, this, I think, is reflective of the two political parties. We have one party, and I will say I agree with what Congresswoman Hageman had to say there. And there's the division is becoming so stark. Now, some are tempted just to shrink back because this leads to conflict and controversy. Folks, if you would hear the testimony of these young people and what we talked about a little bit earlier with Congressman Johnson, what they're being drawn into and pushed into by activists. It reminds me of the scripture when Jesus said, it'd be better that a millstone be tied around your neck and you thrown into the sea if you keep one of these little ones from coming to me. We are directing children down a path of destruction. And folks, it is not a time to be silent. It is a time to speak out with clarity, with boldness, and with conviction against this. And I'm going to say it, and I'm saying it intentionally. It's not hyperbole. I believe this. This is a demonic agenda, and it's being driven by those who are being influenced by spiritual darkness. Joining me now to discuss this is FRC's Dr. Jennifer Bauwens. She testified at this morning's hearing, calling for lawmakers to protect children from adults in authority who are using their influence to push the medically unsound procedures that we are talking about. Joining me to discuss this is Dr. Bauwens. She is the director of our Center for Family Studies here at the Family Research Council. She has more than 25 years of experience as a clinician providing trauma therapy to children and as a researcher investigating the psychological effects of traumatic stress. Dr. Bauwens, welcome back to Washington Watch.
It's always good to be with you, Tony.
So, Jennifer, let's talk a little bit about the committee hearing today. I mean, you know this stuff inside and out, but was there anything that was surprising to you today?
I think one thing that was a little bit disheartening to me was there was a moment where Chloe Cole, who is one of the young ladies who has detransitioned, she had a mastectomy at age 13. And she had a heartfelt connection with one of the other witnesses who was actually for gender affirming care and whose child is going through these procedures right now. And Chloe had this connection with her that was actually it was really beautiful to see. And she was just saying, I don't think this is the right care. I hope that your child, that it doesn't go the way that what I experienced. And she said, my parents were told that they would have a dead child if they didn't go down this path. And so she was offering a real deep empathy And I looked up, and this is what you wouldn't see on C-SPAN. I saw some of the members, the Democrat members, and they were so disengaged and disconnected and almost dissociated from what was happening in the room, as Chloe shared. And that to me spoke volumes, because here you have this young girl who has been through, hell and back to share her story, to prevent other people from going through something like this horror that she's living in. And it was as if it was too much of their time to pay attention. But I think the reality is it's too painful to be perhaps supported by some of the advocacy groups financially for their campaigns, and then to listen to what they're actually aligned with, which is hurting children instead of helping them. And so I think it almost is emotionally intolerable for them.
So, I mean, is that kind of just willfully closing their eyes and their ears, making themselves blind and deaf to the
Yeah,
voices of these young ones crying out for help?
it almost reminded me of the hearing that we learned about last week, where there was information that was shared in a hearing about the surgical procedures and the details of these surgical procedures, and a whole group of Democrats walked out of the room. And that's really a shame, because true compassion wants the best treatment for children. And it's one thing to say, oh, we're the compassionate ones, we're the ones who care for kids, this is life-saving care. But you won't even stay in the room where this kind of care is being discussed, because it's just so egregious to you. But at the same time, you'll endorse it and take money from groups that support it. That's very troublesome to me.
You mentioned Chloe's testimony toward the end of this morning's hearing, where she spoke to her parents, the fact that they were coerced to go down this path. I want to play this clip because this is something you and I have talked about quite frequently, and it is a major leverage point that the left uses on these experimental surgeries and treatments. Play the clip of Chloe, clip 5.
And my parents were required to sign off on these, but it was under duress. I don't think it was really consent. It was coercion. They were told, they were given the false dichotomy of either a child transitions or she dies.
Now, that's not the first time we've heard that.
Yep. Yeah, this is a part of, I would say, almost a part of the intervention itself, that it actually includes this manipulation or threat that somebody's going to kill themselves if they don't get what they want. And to that, I would say, where do we do that in any other mental health practice? I mean, maybe we have some politicians who are willing to give crack pipes to a drug addict, but that's not actually good practice to give the person who's maybe struggling with some issue to lean into and further exploit that issue, rather to find out what's really going on with the person and help them work through it. So that's why we don't typically give people cocaine that are cocaine addicts. It's why we don't withhold food from anorexics. We want to help people walk through those things and come into a place of healing. And then when it comes to this so-called gender affirming care, what we are seeing is we actually lean into the problem instead of trying to resolve the distress that a child is feeling.
I mean, isn't that unethical? I mean, to put that type of pressure onto a parent saying, if you don't do this, your child's going to kill themselves.
It's highly unethical. And it's not based in any kind of good science or practice, for that matter. There's nothing in the scientific literature that can make that conclusion, that a person can make that kind of statement. And here's the other thing. I used to teach intervention research, and I would pick apart the things that we could do on a small scale that we could kind of conceptualize as a means of intervening. And this in itself, I mean, I could take my class through this and show how introducing this line is actually an intervention. It's intended to motivate someone to follow the practice that you're advertising. And so it's unethical because you're actually employing an intervention that has not been tested, that is very dangerous, and it's just not a part of routine practice.
So in trauma therapy, when someone is moving toward behavior that has historically been seen as destructive, you don't facilitate it. I would think the first step is try to find out what is underneath of it. What led you to this point? Is there some trauma that you've experienced in your life? But that seems to be absent when we're talking about the whole issue of transgenderism and the whole LGBTQ agenda. There's no stopping to ask questions why.
Right. And when you look at the studies that show, or look at who's showing up for in a clinical setting for gender dysphoria, most of the time you're talking about people who have one of three diagnoses, certainly others, but you see PTSD is common, depression, anxiety disorders, and no one's stopping to say, where did this come from, and how can I help the child work through those issues? Tony, it reminds me of a situation of a former colleague of mine who was telling me about, this is an adult client who was working with her on a trauma issue, and she was also seeing a gender therapist. And here the adult client said to my former colleague, I feel sick to my stomach every time the gender therapist asks me to say, the name that's not my biological sex, that socially transitioned into a different name. And then she said to my friend, former colleague, she said, I think if I just work on the trauma, then maybe this gender therapist won't even be necessary. But here's the thing, this is an adult. So you can imagine how hard it was for this adult to confront the gender therapist and say, I'm feeling, this doesn't feel right to my spirit. This doesn't feel right to who I am. So, this is a tall order for a 13-year-old child to say, something just doesn't seem right, or I don't know, like
Well,
maybe we should put a hold on this.
did
I
they
mean,
even
what
have
child?
did they have the capacity to think through
Yeah.
that at that age?
Absolutely not. They do not have the capacity, and we know that. I mean, this is where our government doesn't know, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. We have large scale studies going on at NIH that prove, with strong evidence that a child's brain is not developed often until 25, and most importantly, the structures of the brain that are most important to emotional functioning are not developed until later on in life. So no, children do not have the capacity to make these kinds of informed decisions.
And this is something parents need to be aware of. They need to be alert to the fact that this is becoming an industry driven by activists who are pushing children down this assembly line or disassembly line. And they just need to stand up and say no. They need to ask questions, and there's too much at stake at this. And it is a spiritual battle, and we need to be praying as well. Dr. Bauwens, I want to thank you for joining us, and thank you for courageously testifying up on Capitol Hill today.
Thank you, Tony.